Whereas if you use these peripheral receptors that map right onto your spine, you can jump before the snake strikes, hopefully. Cats can do it, by the way, about 10 times as fast. Well, we're pretty good too, as it turns out. Yeah, but not as fast as cats, but fast enough to often escape from snakes.
Nice.
And so you get this first level response that's almost entirely reflexive. That's what the early behaviorists were discovering too when they were talking about stimulus response. Like there are somewhat automatic response systems that are very primordial and basic that do almost a one-to-one mapping of sensory pattern onto behavioral output.
Right.
Very few neural interconnections. And the disadvantage to that is that it's a rather fixed response pattern, and the advantage of is it's super fast. Okay, so now the same pattern propagates up. So imagine the pattern propagates down on your spine and you can react very quickly. Another part of it propagates into the auditory cortex or the visual cortex. And that's what you see with. And those are actually dissociable. So there are people who have a condition called blind sight. So if you ask these people if they can see, they tell you no.
But they still respond.
Well, if you hold up your hand, for example, they can guess with more than 90% accuracy which hand is up. And it seems to be because it's their visual cortex that's damaged and not their retina.
Right.
And a lot of the vision pathways into the brain are still intact, but not the one that mediates conscious vision, which is dependent on the visual cortex.
Right.
But they still have kinetic perception with their eyes. So one of the things I'm doing when I watch you is that I'm picking up where your body is located and I'm mapping that onto my body. And so if I'm seeing you with blind sight with your hand up like this, I'll have a sensation in my body that corresponds to your body position and I can read off that. So it's not exactly vision because I'm not seeing you, but it is a form of vision. And it's even more sophisticated than that. So if you take these people with blind sight and you show them faces that are angry or afraid, and you assess their galvanic skin response, which is a change in sweating, basically, that's associated with emotional arousal, they'll respond differentially to emotional faces, even though they don't know that. That's blind sight. That's part of blind sight. And so when you hear or see something, that pattern is being assessed at multiple levels of a very complex hierarchy. And it's not just bottom up, because that hierarchy also feeds backwards. So for example, by the time you're an adult, most of what you see is memory. You just use the sensory input as a hint to pull up the memory. That's also how you get habituated to things. You know, when you see something for the first time, it's got this glow of novelty, this numinous glow of novelty. And what happens is that and that's complex and difficult to process. And then as you become accustomed to it and you build an internal mental model, you replace the perception with memory because that's faster. The problem is that the memory that you see is only the fractional meaning of the phenomena that's relevant to the encounters that you had. It shuts everything off and what would you say? It takes the magic out of the world. As you replace raw perception with memory, you take the magic out of the world. That's a reasonable way of thinking about it. That's why there's a novelty kick, for example. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because even that relatively straightforward demonstration that you made, that sound that seems self-evident, you said right off the bat that there was a level at which both of us experienced that quite differently. You experienced it differently because you knew you were going to do it. It came as a surprise to me. That surprise was moderated by the fact that I know you, I know your profession, I know your professional status, I know the purpose of what we're doing here. I know the probability that what I know about you indicates that you would do something that was surprising or dangerous, which is very, very low. So even though it was unexpected, it's bounded in its significance by all of that knowledge. And you might say, well, that's independent of the sense data, but it's not. Like, that's a very tricky thing to establish, right? To get that independence, to figure out, well, what's the raw sense data and what's the interpretation? It gets worse than this. You can train dogs to wag their tail when they receive an electric shock. They're happy about it. And so you think electric shock, that's pretty basic sense data. It's like, yeah, yes and no. If you reliably pair a shock, now it depends on the magnitude of the shock, obviously. So there are some boundaries around this, but you can train a dog to be excited about the receipt of an electrical shock if you reliably pair it with a food reward. Because the a priori significance of the electric shock might be pain response, right? Indicative of the potential for physiological damage, because that's approximately what pain is. But if you associate it with the receipt of a reward, then it takes on a dopaminergic cast, which means that the shock becomes indicative of the receipt of a reward. And that's a positive emotion phenomena, and it can override the shock. It's also the case that if you take animals like rats that are pretty intelligent, you put them in a cage, they'll deliver electric shocks to themselves randomly just because they're bored. And so and horses will do that as well. Now, as I said, it's magnitude dependent.
Humans too.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, of course, people do that.
Yeah.
People do that par excellence. And so all of these, it's very difficult to specify a level of analysis where there isn't an interpretive framework simultaneously active as the raw sense data makes itself manifest. Now, I mean, your demonstration was very, what would you say, it cut right to the chase, because a sound like that is, you might say, is not subject to an infinite number of interpretations, right? There's something there, but it's always nested. It seems to be that it's nested inside a hierarchy of interpretations, a very high level hierarchy of interpretations.
Let me say, all of that is great. All of it is beautiful. All of that is directly relevant. So to tie that back into what our philosophical intellectual predicament is now, if we want to say, right, postmodernism as a skeptical project that's given up on everything, versus those who see it as an active, ongoing project that we're learning more and more, that's going to give us a better and better epistemology. All of that is great. So I'm a kind of empiricist, but what I would say is that everything that you have said was, in the early days of empiricism, not known to any of the empiricists. So in many cases, they had very crude understandings of what memory would be, what reflex would be, what emotions would be, perception, right, and so forth. And so, so naturally, then it makes sense that they're trying to insist that we actually are in contact with reality at a basic level. But then very quickly, they are speculating about what's going on in all of these other areas, and their theories are faulty. And it's the weaknesses of those theories that then lead people to start to say, well, empiricism is a failed project, instead of seeing it as an ongoing project. The other thing I would say, or actually there's two other things. One is, as you described the process, you say out there's the slap, there are sound waves. We are making realist claims. There really was a slap. There really are structured energy patterns. And we really do have in our ears or in our hands receptors that are in place that respond to some energy patterns and don't respond to other energy patterns. And all of that, we're making reality claims. And we're saying that then there are causal processes that go on inside the physiological system of the human being. Some of them, as you say, operate in parallel. They have feedback loops, right, and so forth. I think I'm a very minimal empiricist on this, is to say that empiricism only insists that there really is a reality. There is a reality, and it has these patterns, that we are not making up those patterns, and we're not imposing those patterns on the reality. Instead, what we call our sensory receptors is an array of cells that, if there are certain structures in reality, they will respond. But they're not making up those structures in reality. So my nose, for example, has
or at least sometimes they're not making them up.
Okay, but the sometimes comes later. Yeah. Okay, and we can come to that. So my nose, for example, has all kinds of chemical structures out there. It doesn't have a pre-existing theory that out there in reality there are dead, rotting things. right? It's just that if I happen to encounter dead, rotting things, then certain chemicals will be wafting, and then my nose will respond and things will happen in a certain way. And that's an important, whether you say what our noses are doing is kind of imposing a structure on an unstructured reality. And that takes you down the skeptical
the nose
road versus,
is a particularly good example.
right,
because
versus saying that the structures are there and what we have are just latent reception structures that if those structures happen to be present will be responsive. And that thing is all that the empiricists are saying. Now, all of the other stuff where we say, okay, the background set,